is not fully populated, is fully populated. So if you just follow the file one by one, you'll end up getting confused. So we're only going to go over, so the first thing I'm going to do is, remember, because it's called parsing an XML file. Parsing means reading an XML file. So our file name is ajax.xml. So here I create two variables. The first one is var request and XML. Remember, I am going to be writing several functions for this application, because it is always good to every time separate your code into different functions so that you can modularize it, makes it more convenient for you to go step by step. So the first thing is, because I'm going to be writing several functions, I have to create my variables at a global level so that they can be used in the function. So the very first thing is I start with variable request and XML. Then I always like to start with my main function, which we can call the function init, in this case as the very first function. So notice here that I am going, because I've written all this before, I have to go through all the other functions and scroll all the way down, because the main function always comes at the end. Because in the main function you're going to be calling, so all the way, you notice on line 137, I now have the function init. So remember that in order for you to create the XML HTTP request document or the ActiveX object, you start with the code which I explained yesterday, which says if XML HTTP request, then the variable, remember the variable we created at the top, request equals new XML HTTP request. Else, if it's an active object, then request equals new active object, and remember you have to type the server name and the type, so we go Microsoft.xml HTTP. Else, return false, which means don't do anything. So if I don't have that Ajax engine, we don't need to continue. Now, once we do that, remember the procedure it has to go from open, send, and then it receives, and once it retrieves, then you will have to do that. So now, so far what you've done, you've created a new XML HTTP request, so you've created a new ActiveX object, or you've created a new object called request. Now this request, this will be like this is where you're writing Ajax. So now this request document has to open the file it needs to read. So right below that it says request.open get, which means get the file, which one? Ajax.xml, I explained this. The third argument is true, which means if it has a string or data. Request.send is null, which means it's sending nothing to the server, that's why it's null. And then onReady state change equals, so once you create the XML document, once you retrieve the XML document, once it has retrieved it, it goes to a property or an event or a status which says onReady state change. So here I go in and say that request.onReady state equals store XML. So which means that when onReady state change event happens, what do I want to do? I want to retrieve the data from the file. So to retrieve the data from the file, I'm going to write that in a separate function called store XML.
So that's two XML files then?
No, it's only one.
Oh.
Store XML is, you see how the steps are? First you create the Ajax object, then you contact the file,
Yeah.
and then you will read the data of the file. So far what we've said is, okay, first we create the object called request, we use request.open to retrieve the XML file, and when we said that when it's onReady state change happens, read the data. Now to read the data, it's a separate function. And that function we call store XML. So that function, will that come above the main or below? Of course above, because you're calling a function, so your system should know that that function already exists. So even though you're going to write it afterwards, but you're going to place it above the, so now I'll go above. So from this point forward, I'm now going to go above, and right above there, I'm now going to go to the function which is document, which is function store.xml. Now store.xml is right here on line number 82. So here I've written, now remember the ready state and the status properties of the request of the XML of the object, which has code. A code of 4 means that it's completed. A status of 200 means it has succeeded. So here in this function store XML, I say if request.readyState is equal to 4 and request.status equals 200, which means if it's successful, then here I say XML equals request response XML. So that response XML, what does it do? It reads the file.
It gives you the answer on the
Well, so far I'm only reading the data. It doesn't give me anything. So you see, again, follow my steps. Create an object, XML HTTP request object. That's the AJAX. Then open a file. Then check if the file opens successfully. Read the data. I haven't still posted it on the cell. So how do I read the data? Using the response XML property of the XML object. So that's why I say XML equals request. So XML equals, I know the variable name I'm using is XML, but here this XML is only a variable name. I could have called, it's an arbitrary name. So now this line number 86, which says XML equals request.response XML, is reading the data from the file. What's my next step? To put it on the web page. So I create a new function for that, populate cells.
when you go to the point where you ask it to read it,